When a neighbor claimed my private dock as her own, I built a fence around her car, sparking a hilarious lakeside war that changed our community forever. I had barely cast my fishing line that morning when the shrill sound of Karen's voice tore through the quiet air like a siren of pure entitlement. And before I could even turn around, she had marched halfway down my private dock with her arms flailing as if she were leading a parade, screaming that the lake belonged to everyone and my dock was community property. My coffee mug slipped from my hand, splashing on the wooden boards as I stared at her in disbelief, wondering how in the world someone could trespass, scream at me on my own land, and still look offended when I told her to get off. The absurdity of it would have been hilarious if not for the fact that this was the third time this week she had pulled the same stunt, and the escalation in her theatrics made me wonder what fresh hell she had planned next. She was already pulling out her phone, threatening to call the lake patrol, whatever that was supposed to mean, while her yappy dog tried to pee on my tackle box. I knew right then that this wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was war, and the kind of war where only one of us was going to keep our sanity intact. It all started innocently enough a few weeks earlier when I first moved into this lakeside property. A quiet retreat I had bought after years of city chaos, hoping for peace, fishing, and maybe the occasional neighborly hello over a shared beer. The dock came with the property clearly marked on the deed, fenced on my side. Private signs posted everywhere. Yet Karen from the house 2 doors down decided those signs were apparently just decoration. The first day I met her, she marched right up to me, introduced herself by announcing that she was the unofficial Lake Committee chairperson, and proceeded to inform me that my dock would be open for public enjoyment. I had laughed at the time, thinking it was a joke, but the look on her face told me she wasn't kidding. Every day since then, the absurdity grew. She brought strangers to fish off my dock, parked her golf cart on my grass, and once even set up a full picnic on my pier while I was gone. I'd been patient, too patient, because I wanted to avoid making enemies before I'd even unpacked all my boxes. But that morning, with her shrieking at me about selfish private ownership, something inside me snapped. The worst part wasn't even Karen's voice echoing over the lake or her dog marking its territory on my stuff. The worst part was the audience she had brought this time. A couple of other neighbors had gathered at the end of the cul-de-sac, phones out, filming what they clearly thought would be another episode of the Crazy New Guy vs. Karen. And I felt the heat rise in my face as every second turned into some bizarre social media circus. She climbed halfway down the dock, ignoring my repeated orders to leave, and yelled that she had checked local rules, which apparently in her mind meant anything touching water was now the town's shared property. My fists clenched around my fishing pole, not because I'd ever lay a hand on her, but because I needed something to keep from exploding. When I finally told her that the next step would be the sheriff, she rolled her eyes dramatically and screamed at the top of her lungs that I was threatening a defenseless woman, just loud enough for every phone camera to capture it. That was the moment the idea hit me like a lightning strike. If Karen wanted a battle over what belonged to me, then I was going to fight it on my terms, not hers. I spent the rest of that day gathering everything I needed to make sure no one but me could set foot on my dock again. A heavy-duty chain, a padlock the size of a fist, and a bright red sign that left zero room for interpretation. That evening, I watched Karen's silhouette pacing her yard, glaring over at my dock like I just erected a private fortress on her family's ancestral land. The next morning, sure enough, she marched down again, only to find a brand new iron gate chain shut at the entrance to my dock. The way her face turned from smug superiority to boiling rage in 2 seconds flat was a sight I'll never forget. She kicked the gate, threatened to call every agency from Parks and Recreation to the FBI, and even tried to climb over before giving up in defeat. I almost felt bad, but that feeling evaporated when she screamed that she wouldn't forget this and stomped back to her house as if she were plotting my personal destruction. But locking the gate was only step one. I knew Karen's type. She wasn't going to stop just because I'd drawn a line. She would come back louder and more determined, probably dragging half the neighborhood with her. So, I decided to vanish for a few days, and let her rage burn itself out while I enjoyed what I had moved here for in the first place. Fishing in peace. I loaded up my cooler, grabbed my camping gear, and spent 3 blissful days on the water, catching bass, watching sunsets, and finally feeling the tension drain out of my shoulders. Of course, in the back of my mind, I knew that every hour I stayed away probably drove Karen crazier. And that thought made me smile. When I finally came back home, sunburned, happy, and smelling like the lake, I noticed something strange before I even pulled into my driveway. Karen's shiny SUV was parked half on my lawn, half across my driveway, blocking me from pulling in. A note under the wiper read, "Since you think you own the lake, I'm parking here until you learn to share." My jaw dropped. The audacity was unreal. I sat there in my truck, staring at the car. That was now trespassing on my private property, and something inside me switched gears completely. If she wanted to play games, then fine. I was done trying to be the reasonable neighbor. This time, I was going to end it in a way she'd never forget. I walked into my shed, grabbed my tools, and with a grin spreading across my face, I started hauling out fence posts. If Karen thought my dock belonged to her, she was about to find out what it felt like to have her precious car publicly fenced in on my land with no way to drive it out until I decided to set it free. And that, I knew, was only the beginning of what was about to become the most chaotic, hilarious war this quiet little lakeside neighborhood had ever seen. The next morning, the lake was eerily calm, as if it sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. I woke up early, my mind buzzing with the plan that had crystallized overnight. Karen had pushed every boundary imaginable since the day I moved here. And now, after finding her SUV squatting on my driveway like a spoiled child's toy left where it didn't belong, I had no intention of letting her get away with it. I brewed a cup of coffee, sipped it slowly on my porch, and stared at that shiny vehicle blocking my path. It was as though the sun itself was spotlighting her arrogance, glinting off the polished hood while every fiber in me screamed that this was the final straw. My dock, my lawn, my patience, all had been trampled under Karen's warped sense of entitlement, and the time for polite warnings and empty threats was over. Today was about poetic justice, the kind that doesn't involve yelling or lawyers. Just a quiet, methodical action that makes its point so clearly, even someone as blind to boundaries as Karen can't ignore it. I set my mug down, grabbed my tool belt, and stepped off the porch with a calm determination that even surprised me. Before starting, I took one last look toward Karen's house, half expecting her to be peering out through the blinds like she usually did, ready to launch into another tirade about how the whole lake was basically her playground. But the windows were closed, curtains drawn, no sign of movement. Either she was sleeping off the smugness of yesterday or more likely planning her next ambush. Either way, this was my chance to turn the tables without interruption. I hauled the first batch of wooden fence posts to the edges of my driveway, marking out a neat rectangle around her SUV. Each thud of the hammer into the ground oddly satisfying. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my sanity with every strike. As I worked, I imagined Karen's reaction when she returned to find her car perfectly boxed in on my property. No room to maneuver, no escape route, just a fence standing like a silent reminder of what happens when you push someone too far. The neighbors began to notice what I was doing. First came Old Man Harris, who pretended to be walking his dog, but kept circling closer, curiosity written all over his face. Then a couple from across the street strolled over with their morning coffees, standing at a safe distance, but clearly enjoying the show. None of them said a word, but the smirks they exchanged told me everything I needed to know. Karen had made herself a village-wide nuisance long before I arrived, and now everyone was silently rooting for me to deliver the karmic punchline they had all dreamed of, but never dared attempt. A little thrill of camaraderie washed over me as I drilled the crossbars in place, forming a tight square around the SUV, leaving just enough space for me to walk around it and admire my handiwork. When the gate latch clicked shut on the final panel, I stood back and surveyed the scene. Karen's car was now a caged beast, trapped on my land with absolutely no way out unless I allowed it. The best part was legally she didn't have a leg to stand on. She had trespassed first and I was just protecting my property from further invasion. By mid-morning, word had spread like wildfire. More neighbors emerged, pretending to garden or sweep their driveways, but really just waiting for the inevitable eruption. I didn't have to wait long. Around 10 o'clock, the front door of Karen's house slammed open with such force I thought it might fly off the hinges, and out she stormed, her face already red, voice warming up like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. She took 3 steps before spotting the fence, and the strangled sound that escaped her throat was a mix between a gasp, a screech, and something you might hear from a bird of prey swooping in for a kill. She sprinted toward her SUV, stopped dead in front of the fence, and started rattling the panels as if sheer willpower could tear them down. "What have you done to my car?" she shrieked, spinning around to face me. I leaned casually on my porch railing, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, and called back, "What car?" "Oh, you mean the one illegally parked on my private driveway?" I thought it needed a little boundary education. The laughter that bubbled up from the onlookers was quiet but undeniable, and Karen's eyes darted around as she realized she had an audience. Her fury doubled, her words tumbling out incoherently about police lawsuits and how I was violating her rights. I walked over slowly, letting every second drag out, savoring the moment as much as the neighbors clearly were. "Funny thing about rights, Karen," I said, stopping just beyond the fence. "They usually don't involve trespassing on someone else's land. But I tell you what, you can have your car back anytime you want. All you got to do is admit in front of everyone here that my dock and my property are private and you'll stay off them from now on." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and I could almost see the internal war raging behind her eyes, the desperate need to win clashing with the humiliating prospect of publicly conceding defeat. For a moment, I thought she might actually take the deal. But then her pride kicked in full force, and she screamed for the cops. When the patrol car finally arrived, a bored-looking deputy stepped out, clearly already aware of Karen's reputation in the neighborhood. She launched into a dramatic monologue about unlawful imprisonment of her vehicle, waving her arms wildly as if she were the victim of a crime against humanity. The deputy calmly listened, nodded, then turned to me. I handed him my property deed, showed him the boundary markers, explained the repeated trespassing, the notes, the deliberate driveway blockage, and then simply said, "I just fenced in what was already mine." The deputy scratched his chin, glanced at the fence, then at Karen, and finally said, "Ma'am, it looks like your car is on his property. Best way to get it out is to ask nicely or move it when he opens the gate." The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's face contorted, every ounce of rage visible, but she couldn't argue with the law standing right there. She turned on her heel, stormed back to her house without another word, leaving her SUV trapped like a monument to her own arrogance. As the patrol car drove away, the neighbors slowly dispersed, grins plastered on their faces, some giving me discreet thumbs up. I stood there, fence gate locked, feeling an immense wave of satisfaction crash over me. For the first time since moving here, I felt in control, not just of my property, but of my sanity. Of course, I knew this wouldn't be the end. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. There would be retaliation, plots, perhaps an even bigger spectacle. Next time. But now the power dynamic had shifted and everyone on this lake had witnessed it. I had drawn my line in wood and steel, and Karen had no choice but to face it. I headed inside, a smile tugging at my lips, already planning my next fishing trip, knowing full well that while she might stew in her house, plotting revenge, her precious SUV would remain exactly where she left it. A caged reminder that not everything in this world is hers for the taking. The following day dawned with a strange mix of calm and tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavy even before the sun has climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist. I woke up half expecting to find Karen's SUV gone, thinking maybe she had finally swallowed her pride during the night and called a tow truck to drag it out. But when I stepped outside, there it was, still boxed in by my neatly constructed fence, standing as both a trophy of victory and a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in my face. I could practically feel her eyes boring into me from behind her blinds, waiting for me to make the next move. I had no intention of backing down, yet I also knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. And after yesterday's humiliation in front of the entire neighborhood, she'd be cooking up something dramatic, ridiculous, and possibly illegal to regain control of the narrative. I brewed my coffee, sat on the porch swing, and mentally prepared for whatever storm was about to hit because with Karen, a storm was always brewing. By mid-morning, the peace shattered. Karen emerged like a queen marching into battle. Her hair tied in a bun so tight it looked like it hurt, wearing oversized sunglasses as though shielding herself from the shame of yesterday's fiasco. But she wasn't alone this time. Two unfamiliar men followed her, one lugging a toolbox, the other carrying what looked suspiciously like a bolt cutter. My eyebrows shot up as I watched the little procession approach my driveway. She stopped in front of the fence, turned to her accomplices, and with a dramatic sweep of her hand, commanded, "Cut it open." I set my coffee down, walked to the porch steps, and called out, "Morning, Karen. You sure you want to do that? Pretty sure destroying private property is still a crime." She shot me a glare so sharp it could have sliced through steel and barked something about how I had illegally trapped her vehicle and she had the right to free it. The taller of the two men hesitated, glancing between me and Karen, clearly uncomfortable, but she crossed her arms and tapped her foot like an impatient boss giving orders to underlings. That was my cue to up the ante. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's office on speaker. My voice calm but loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Hi, yeah, this is the guy with the trespassing issue from yesterday," I said, eyeing Karen the whole time. "Looks like the same person. Is back with tools and trying to cut through my fence. Should I just let them? Or would you like to send someone to stop a property damage incident?" The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The bolt cutter man immediately lowered his hands, muttering that he wasn't getting involved in anything illegal. Karen's face flushed crimson, her anger making her tremble. But the growing audience of neighbors silently gathering at their windows and porches meant she couldn't risk another public spectacle ending with law enforcement siding against her. She snapped at the men to wait, hissed that this wasn't over, and stomped away to make yet another phone call, no doubt hoping to find someone in authority who would take her side. For the next hour, I watched her pacing up and down her lawn, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly as she unloaded her version of events to whoever was unlucky enough to be on the other end. Meanwhile, I calmly sat on my porch, deliberately baiting her with my serenity, sipping lemonade now instead of coffee, enjoying the rare sense of control I had over the chaos she usually brought into my life. Finally, a county code enforcement truck pulled up and out stepped a tired-looking officer who clearly didn't want to be there. Karen rushed over, unleashing her torrent of grievances, pointing wildly at the fence, at my dock, at me like she was prosecuting the case of the century. The officer patiently listened, then walked over to me for my side. I handed over the same documents as yesterday, showed the clear boundary lines on my property map, explained the repeated trespasses, the driveway blocking, and my fencing solution. The officer took one long look at the situation, rubbed his temples, and told Karen there was nothing illegal about a man fencing his own land. If she wanted her car back, all she had to do was ask permission to move it. When I opened the gate, the look on her face was priceless, a mix of disbelief, rage, and desperation. She turned on me like a cornered animal, her voice shaking as she spat, "You're ruining this community with your selfishness. Everyone here has always shared this lake. You're just some city guy trying to change everything." That's when Old Man Harris decided he'd had enough of watching silently. From his porch, he called out, "Karen, you've been pulling this stunt for years, and we've all been too polite to stop you. Maybe it's time you learned. Not everything revolves around what you want." A ripple of murmured agreement rolled through the watching neighbors. A chorus of quiet rebellion against the self-appointed queen of the lake. For the first time, Karen's confidence faltered. Her gaze darted from face to face. Realizing she no longer had the crowd on her side, she tried one last tactic, attempting to play the victim card as tears welled up in her eyes, claiming she felt trapped and unsafe, that I was harassing her and turning everyone against her. But the officer wasn't buying it. The neighbors weren't buying it, and honestly, no one could forget the countless times she had marched onto other people's docks, bossing them around like she owned the entire shoreline. The officer ended it with a simple, firm statement. "Ma'am, you can either ask him politely to open the fence, or you can leave the vehicle where it is until you're ready to have a civilized conversation." Then he got in his truck and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, humiliated, fuming, and visibly cracking under the weight of her own failed schemes. I almost felt a pang of sympathy watching her retreat. But it lasted about 2 seconds before I remembered every ruined morning, every stranger she invited onto my dock, every smug smirk she'd thrown my way, as if daring me to challenge her supposed authority over my land. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had made it their life's mission to control everyone around them. And now, for the first time, Karen had no control. She couldn't force me to back down. Couldn't convince anyone to side with her. Couldn't even free her own car without swallowing her pride. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in gold, I sat on my dock, fishing rod in hand, the water lapping gently against the pilings. Behind me, the fence around Karen's SUV stood firm, casting long shadows in the twilight. Neighbors strolled by, some stopping to chat, quietly thanking me for doing what no one else had dared to do. A few shared their own Karen horror stories, laughing nervously at memories of her antics. Relieved someone had finally pushed back. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I belonged here, like I wasn't just the new guy anymore, but the man who had broken the spell Karen had cast over the neighborhood for years. As I reeled in my line, a small grin crept across my face. This wasn't just a battle over a dock anymore. This was a turning point, a shift in power that Karen wasn't going to accept lying down. The next day started off deceptively peaceful. The kind of calm that almost feels staged, like the world is holding its breath before something ridiculous happens. I woke up to the sound of loons calling over the water, made myself a big breakfast, and sat out on the porch with my coffee, hoping maybe Karen had finally learned her lesson. But knowing her, I doubted it. Sure enough, just as I was rinsing my mug, a strange sound drifted over from the direction of my driveway. The unmistakable beep beep. Beep of a large vehicle backing up. I stepped outside to find a tow truck positioning itself near my fence. Karen, standing beside it with a triumphant look on her face as if this was the moment she'd been waiting for. Her arms were crossed, chin tilted high, the kind of smugness that only comes from believing you found a way to twist reality in your favor. The tow truck driver glanced at me nervously, clearly uncomfortable. But Karen was already barking orders about how he should pull down the fence and liberate her car. I walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, each stride calm, controlled, but my mind racing with disbelief at just how far this woman would go. When I reached the fence, I planted my hands on top of it and said, loudly enough for both of them to hear, if that truck touches one piece of my property, you'll both be on the hook for destruction of private assets. I've got cameras rolling and yesterday's deputy on speed dial. You sure you want to play this game? The driver's face drained of color, his hands hovering over the lever, and he turned to Karen, mumbling that he wasn't about to risk his job or a lawsuit for this nonsense. Karen screeched like a kettle left on the stove too long, shouting about how my fence was illegal and this was a hostage situation. But when the driver climbed back into his cab and drove off, leaving her sputtering in the dust, the neighborhood erupted in muffled laughter from behind curtains and fences. Karen spun around, face redder than a stop sign, and locked eyes on me like a predator denied its prey. You think you're clever, she spat, pointing an accusatory finger at me. But you're going to regret humiliating me in front of everyone. I tilted my head, feigning confusion, and replied in the calmest tone I could muster. Karen, you humiliated yourself the moment you parked on my lawn and thought you owned the place. All I did was build a fence. That only fueled her rage more, and she stormed off, yelling something about bringing in lawyers, the homeowners association, and even threatening to get the mayor involved. I watched her go, a mix of amusement and weariness in my chest, because with Karen, there was no telling how far her delusions of authority would take her. I locked the gate on the fence again, checked the chains for good measure, and went about my day. But every muscle in my body stayed tense, knowing this wasn't the last escalation. By afternoon, I got my answer. A small convoy of cars pulled up near Karen's house. People stepping out dressed in business casual, clipboards in hand, looking like some kind of official task force. My heart sank for a moment, wondering if she had actually managed to twist the story enough to make this an official investigation. But when they walked over, I noticed the familiar logo of the HOA embroidered on their shirts, and it all made sense. Karen had called in reinforcements, hoping to use their self-appointed power to force me to bend to her will. The HOA president, a woman named Marcia, with a pinched expression and a stack of papers under her arm, marched up to my fence and introduced herself in a tone that tried to sound polite but dripped with condescension. She launched into a lecture about how shared community values were important and how fences should not disrupt neighborly harmony. I listened silently, arms crossed, letting her finish before calmly explaining that my fence was entirely on my property, that Karen had repeatedly trespassed and harassed me, and that this had nothing to do with shared values, but everything to do with basic respect and legal boundaries. I even handed her the property deed again, highlighting the clearly marked lines that showed Karen had no claim to my driveway or dock. As I spoke, more neighbors gathered around, this time not staying silent. Old Man Harris piped up, recounting how Karen had been a menace for years, barging onto other people's docks, blocking driveways, even trying to dictate what color someone could paint their porch swing once. The murmurs of agreement spread, and suddenly the HOA representatives were no longer looking at me like I was the problem. Instead, they turned to Karen, who was standing behind them, arms flailing, shouting that everyone was lying, that this whole street had conspired against her. It was a spectacle worthy of reality television, the mighty self-proclaimed Queen of the Lake unraveling under the weight of her own behavior. Finally, Marcia sighed, adjusted her glasses, and said that the HOA had no authority to override private property rights, suggesting Karen move her car and drop the matter before legal trouble found her instead. The look on Karen's face was pure devastation mixed with indignation, as if the entire world had betrayed her. She stormed off without another word. The HOA folks retreating quickly to their cars, clearly eager to wash their hands of the drama. With the crowd dispersing once again, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of victory and unease. Karen had been publicly stripped of her imagined authority twice now. But people like her didn't just stop when their schemes failed. They doubled down, came back harder, and found new ways to stir chaos. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the fence, adding another layer of chain to make sure no bolt cutters or tow trucks would succeed where the first attempt had failed. My phone buzzed a few times with texts from neighbors thanking me for standing up to her, some even offering to pitch in for the cost of the fence just for the satisfaction of watching Karen squirm. It was oddly heartwarming knowing that my private battle was slowly turning into a communal stand against years of unchecked bullying. As the sun set, painting the lake in streaks of orange and pink, I sat at the end of my dock, casting my line and letting the water soothe the frayed edges of my nerves. Yet, even in that tranquility, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. The way she had looked at me before retreating, the venom in her promise that I'd regret crossing her, it wasn't the face of someone who planned to let things go. If anything, it was the look of someone preparing for all-out war. And knowing Karen's flair for the dramatic, her next move wouldn't be subtle or sensible. It would be loud, messy, and designed to make everyone in this neighborhood forget the humiliation she'd already suffered. I reeled in my line slowly, staring out across the water, and whispered to myself that whatever was coming, I'd be ready. Because Karen had made one crucial mistake from the start, she underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. And now that I'd drawn my line in wood, steel, and stubborn resolve, there was no turning back. I woke up the next morning to the sound of something tapping against my window. A rhythmic metallic clang that immediately set my nerves on edge. At first, I thought it was a branch swaying in the wind. But then I heard voices hushed but urgent coming from the front yard. I slipped on a shirt and stepped outside quietly, only to find Karen crouched near my fence with a crowbar in her hand and a young man I didn't recognize holding a flashlight, even though the sun was already up. My jaw tightened as I realized she had actually resorted to a pre-dawn break-in attempt to free her car. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but the sheer audacity killed any trace of amusement. I cleared my throat loudly, and the sight of Karen freezing mid-pry was something I'd have paid good money to capture on camera. Horror. Accomplice bolted immediately, dropping the flashlight as he sprinted down the road, leaving her alone in the act. Karen turned slowly, plastering on a fake smile, and muttered something about checking for fence safety hazards. My voice stayed calm but sharp as I asked whether she realized trespassing with tools in hand looked a lot like attempted vandalism and whether she wanted me to get the sheriff involved again. She stammered, rage barely contained under her thin excuse before finally huffing and stomping back to her house, leaving the crowbar behind like a failed weapon of war. It was clear now that Karen's obsession had tipped from entitlement into full-blown madness. The humiliation of being outsmarted, of losing the backing of both the law and the HOA, had twisted her behavior into something unpredictable and dangerous. I decided then that this wasn't just about defending my dock anymore. It was about ending this once and for all before she pushed things to a point where someone actually got hurt. I reinforced the fence again, this time adding motion sensors and a camera that sent alerts directly to my phone. I even called a buddy from town who owned a construction company and asked him to deliver a few more heavy-duty posts and locks. If Karen wanted to escalate, I would escalate. Smarter, stronger, and always one step ahead. As I worked, I noticed the growing crowd of neighbors watching from a distance, some bringing lawn chairs as if this feud had become the morning entertainment. But this wasn't just a show for me anymore. It was a fight for peace in a place I had moved to. Precisely because I thought I could escape the insanity of city life. By midday, a delivery truck rolled up and my friend Jake jumped out with a grin, carrying everything I had asked for and then some. As we worked together to strengthen the barricade, Jake listened to the whole saga, shaking his head in disbelief every few minutes. Man, I've seen some crazy neighbors, but this one takes the cake, he muttered as he tightened bolts on a new steel reinforced section. The laughter from the spectators grew louder each time Jake cracked a joke about Karen's antics, and I could see her blinds twitching furiously from her house across the way. She hated this, hated losing, hated being the center of a joke instead of the queen of command, and it only made me more determined to make this fence unbreakable. We even added a sign that read, "Private property. Unauthorized vehicles may be decorated," just to twist the knife a little. Sure enough, within an hour, Karen came storming out, screaming about harassment and threatening legal action yet again. But this time, nobody even pretended to support her. Harris yelled from his porch that maybe she should stop parking where she didn't belong. Others clapped sarcastically, and the collective laughter made her retreat faster than I thought possible. It felt like the whole neighborhood was finally shedding the fear she had used to control them for years. That evening, I finally opened the gate and moved Karen's car just enough to roll it to the edge of my driveway, leaving it perfectly accessible for her to take back. I locked the fence behind it and taped a note to her driver's side window that read, "Your vehicle has been evicted. Please respect property lines going forward." For a moment, I thought that might be the end of it. A chance for her to slink away quietly and pretend none of this had ever happened. But Karen didn't do quiet. Instead, as darkness fell, she unleashed her latest stunt, a giant hand-painted banner strung across her lawn that read, "Beware the dock dictator. He hates sharing." Lit up by floodlights like it was some sort of protest march headquarters. I stood there staring, half amused, half dumbfounded as she shouted through a bullhorn about how I was ruining the community spirit, how the lake was for everyone, how I was a tyrant in flip-flops. Neighbors came out in droves. Some yelling for her to shut up, others laughing so hard they had to lean on fences for support. It was chaotic, absurd, and yet somehow the perfect representation of how far she had spiraled. I walked over to the edge of my yard and waited for a pause in her rant before asking, "Karen, quick question. If you hate me so much, why do you keep coming onto my property?" The crowd erupted in fresh laughter, her face turning crimson as she stuttered and sputtered, unable to come up with a comeback. Eventually, she stomped inside, slamming her door hard enough to rattle her own windows, leaving the ridiculous banner flapping in the night breeze. I stood there for a long time. Afterward, the neighbors slowly dispersing, the tension fading into the cool evening air. It was becoming clear that this feud had transformed from a boundary dispute into something bigger, a battle over pride and power that Karen simply couldn't afford to lose in her own mind. But it was also becoming clear that the entire neighborhood was finally on my side, fed up with her antics, emboldened by someone finally standing up to her. Later that night, sitting on my dock under the stars, I realized that despite all the chaos, a strange sense of community had grown out of this madness. People I'd barely met before were now dropping by to chat, share snacks, swap stories about their own Karen encounters. I wasn't just the new guy anymore. I was the man who had drawn a line in the sand, or rather a fence on the driveway, and refused to let a bully trample over it. It gave me a sense of belonging I hadn't felt since moving in. But it also left me on high alert, knowing Karen wouldn't let things end here. She had been humiliated too many times. Her self-made kingdom crumbling in full view of the people she once bossed around. The next round wouldn't just be angry words or childish stunts. Karen would come back swinging, desperate to claw back control. And I had a gut feeling that whatever she did next would make everything that had happened so far look tame in comparison. I cast my fishing line out into the dark water, the ripples spreading like whispers of the battle yet to come, and I promised myself I'd be ready for it, no matter how wild or unpredictable her next move turned out to be. The next morning arrived with an eerie stillness that set every nerve in my body on edge. After the chaos of the past few days, the silence felt unnatural, like the pause in a storm where you know the worst part is still gathering strength somewhere unseen. I stepped outside with my coffee, scanning Karen's property for any sign of movement. The ridiculous banner had been taken down overnight, and her blinds were shut tight, which was unusual for someone who liked to keep watch over the entire neighborhood like a self-appointed warden. My gut told me this wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The kind of calm that only comes when someone is planning a bigger, bolder strike. I'd learned enough about Karen to know that humiliation didn't break her spirit. It only made her more dangerous, because nothing in her world could be more intolerable than losing control. Sure enough, around mid-morning, a series of delivery trucks rolled up to her house. Men in uniforms unloading stacks of signs, megaphones, folding chairs, and what looked suspiciously like barricades. My stomach sank, realizing she wasn't backing down. She was preparing to wage a full-blown public spectacle against me, the kind that would make yesterday's banner look like child's play. Within an hour, Karen had transformed her lawn into what looked like a protest rally staging ground. Brightly painted signs reading "Down with Doc Tyranny and Lakes are for sharing" lined the street, while a few people from out of town, likely friends or fellow drama enthusiasts she had called in, gathered with cameras and homemade picket signs of their own. The noise started as a low murmur but quickly grew into chants echoing down the lakeside. A bizarre parody of real activism aimed entirely at me and my fenced-in driveway. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching the circus unfold, neighbors peeking from their windows or standing on their porches with expressions that ranged from amusement to disbelief. Karen spotted me, grabbed a megaphone, and launched into a theatrical speech about how I was destroying community spirit, hoarding nature, and turning a friendly lakeside paradise into a private fortress. She delivered her words with the passion of a politician on a campaign trail, but every exaggerated sentence only seemed to make her look more ridiculous in the eyes of the watching neighbors. Still, the spectacle was loud, chaotic, and undeniably irritating, especially since news vans had started pulling up to film what they were calling a local property dispute gone wild. I knew letting this turn into a shouting match would only feed her performance. So, I decided to strike in a way Karen wouldn't see coming. With calm logic and a few well-timed surprises of my own, I called my attorney, explained the situation, and within an hour, he arrived with a stack of documents outlining every trespass, every police visit, and every incident of harassment I had endured since moving in. Together, we set up a small table at the end of my driveway, calmly presenting the paperwork to the curious onlookers and even to the reporters who had shown up. My attorney explained in a measured voice that my property rights were clear, that Karen's car had been trespassing, that every action I had taken was legal and documented, and that the real issue wasn't community spirit, but a repeated violation of private boundaries. The contrast between Karen's shrill shouting and our quiet, fact-based presentation couldn't have been more striking. And I could see the shift in the crowd's demeanor as more and more people began to realize this wasn't some petty feud. It was one person refusing to respect basic rules that everyone else managed to follow. Karen, sensing her narrative slipping away, doubled down with theatrics. She threw herself on the ground at one point, sobbing dramatically about oppression and neighborly betrayal, clutching one of her protest signs like a flag on a battlefield. It might have been convincing to someone who didn't know her, but to this crowd, it was just another performance in a long history of over-the-top behavior. Laughter rippled through the neighborhood as Harris yelled from his porch that this was the best entertainment he'd had in years. Even some of the people Karen had invited to join her protest started edging away, embarrassed to be associated with such obvious nonsense. The final nail in the coffin came when one of the news reporters asked Karen directly why she had parked on my lawn in the first place, and she launched into a rambling explanation about how the lake belongs to everyone and therefore my driveway, dock, and apparently my entire yard were community property. The look on the reporter's face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief and amusement that would probably go viral once the clip aired. By late afternoon, Karen's so-called protest had crumbled. Her out-of-town friends disappeared. The news vans drove off chasing more legitimate stories, and the neighborhood settled into a kind of satisfied calm, the kind that comes after watching a tyrant lose their imaginary throne. I took down my small table, thanked the attorney, and stood for a moment, just breathing in the quiet that finally returned. But I knew Karen wouldn't stop here. Losing in front of the neighbors was bad enough. Losing in front of cameras and a public audience, that would burn her pride deeper than anything before. She would retreat for now, lick her wounds, and come back with something meaner. Maybe even something designed to hurt me financially or legally. I couldn't let my guard down. Not for a second, because this wasn't about the dock anymore. This was a war she had decided to fight until she either won or destroyed everything around her trying. That evening, as I walked along the dock, watching the sunset bleed across the lake, Harris strolled over with a couple of beers, handing me one with a grin. "Never thought I'd see someone finally take her down a peg," he said, shaking his head. We talked for a while and he told me stories about Karen's reign of terror over the years, threatening to fine people for hanging laundry outside, demanding that children stay off the public beach after a certain hour because it disturbed her, even once trying to evict a family of ducks from a pond because she claimed they made too much noise. It was laughable, but also sobering, realizing just how long she had been allowed to bulldoze through this neighborhood unchecked. Harris admitted that most people had been too scared or too tired to stand up to her, worried about the drama she'd unleash if challenged. "But you," he said, clinking his beer bottle against mine, "you didn't just stand up to her. You built a fence around her car. That's legend." We laughed until our sides hurt, the tension of the past days lifting for just a moment under the weight of shared camaraderie. Yet, as the stars came out and the lake grew quiet again, my mind kept circling back to that uneasy feeling in my gut. Karen wasn't done. The look in her eyes before she slunk back into her house after the protest had been different this time. Not just angry, but calculating, the kind of look someone gets when they've decided to stop playing by any rules at all. Whatever her next move was, it wouldn't be public or dramatic. It would be sneaky, underhanded, something meant to make my life miserable in ways no one else could see. I sat on the edge of the dock, staring at the moon's reflection on the water, and promised myself that no matter what Karen tried next, I wouldn't let her win. The final chapter of this bizarre war began just before dawn 2 days later, when I woke to the sound of water splashing violently near my dock, followed by a loud crash that rattled my windows. I rushed outside, heart pounding, only to find Karen waist deep in the lake, screaming hysterically, while her SUV sat half submerged against the edge of my dock. The fence I had carefully built days earlier, lying in splintered ruins beside it. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. She had clearly driven her car onto my property again, but this time in some unhinged attempt to reclaim dominance over what she believed to be public space. She had tried to ram through the fence and ended up plunging partway into the water instead. Neighbors startled by the commotion poured out of their houses, phones recording as Karen shrieked accusations at me, blaming me for trapping her in this predicament as though I had somehow lured her into crashing her own car into my dock. The absurdity of it all might have been hilarious if not for the growing fear that this feud had reached a level of recklessness that could have ended with someone seriously hurt. I shouted over the chaos, telling her to get to shore while I called emergency services. But even as firefighters arrived to help, Karen kept screaming about her so-called rights to the lake and how this was all part of my plot to ruin her life. The spectacle turned into a full-blown neighborhood event. Cameras flashing, people gasping and laughing in equal measure as the once self-appointed queen of the community stood soaked, shivering, and publicly humiliated in front of everyone. As the tow truck finally pulled her vehicle from the water, and police officers tried to piece together what had actually happened, I stood calmly on my porch, providing my account for the record. The fence had been completely inside my property line. Karen had no permission to enter my driveway again, let alone to attempt to ram her car through a barricade. The officers exchanged knowing glances, clearly familiar with her antics by now, and began questioning her more firmly than I had ever seen before. Karen's usual theatrics were losing their power fast, especially with the clear evidence of her reckless driving and the mountain of previous reports stacked against her. By the time the sun was fully up, the police had issued her multiple citations. A tow company had hauled her waterlogged SUV away, and the entire neighborhood stood united in a way I hadn't thought possible just a week ago. Harris clapped me on the back, muttering that this was the day Karen had finally destroyed her own empire of entitlement, and others nodded, relieved that maybe now they could live without constant fear of her next overreach. The rest of that morning unfolded like the ending of a long, exhausting storm. Karen, finally realizing the fight was over, trudged back to her house in wet clothes, her once booming voice reduced to bitter muttering. The police made it clear that any further trespass on my property would result in immediate arrest, and neighbors began talking about filing a formal complaint to have the HOA strip her of any influence she'd once wielded. For the first time since moving here, the air around the lake felt light, free of the tension that had hung over us all. Since the first day Karen declared herself the ruler of the shoreline, I rebuilt my fence, sturdier than ever. Not as a challenge this time, but as a final statement that boundaries, once crossed too many times, must be made unbreakable. People came by offering me drinks, food, and thanks, turning what had once been my private retreat into a place of community, where laughter and shared stories replaced the anxiety Karen had brought with her wherever she went. That evening, as I sat on my repaired dock with a fishing pole in hand, the water calm and reflecting the fading hues of sunset, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. The kind of peace you earn only after fighting hard for what's right. Not because you wanted conflict, but because you refused to be bullied into surrendering what belonged to you. Karen's house stayed dark and silent across the way. The woman who once believed she owned the entire lake, now invisible, stripped of the power her noise and theatrics had given her for so long. The neighborhood seemed to breathe in unison, children playing near the water, adults sharing quiet conversations without looking over their shoulders for the next burst of chaos. It struck me then that what had started as one woman trying to claim my dock had turned into something much bigger. A lesson in standing firm, in drawing a line that no one should be allowed to cross, no matter how loudly they shout or how many false claims they make. Later, Harris joined me on the dock with a couple of beers, just as he had before, and we sat in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the stars blink to life over the lake. Finally, he said what everyone else had probably been thinking, that Karen had ruled this community unchecked for years, using fear and fake authority to bend people to her will, and that it took someone new, someone unwilling to accept the insanity as normal to finally stop her. I realized then that this wasn't just my victory. It belonged to everyone who had suffered under her self-made tyranny, but had never found a way to push back. My fence wasn't just wood and steel anymore. It had become a symbol of a neighborhood reclaiming its sanity. As the night deepened, I thought about how close I had come to just giving in those first few days, letting Karen walk all over me to avoid conflict, and how different things would have been if I had. Sometimes the easiest path in the short term leads to the hardest life in the long term. And I was glad I had chosen the harder path early, because now I had more than just my dock. I had a community that respected me, a home that finally felt like a safe haven, and a story that would be told for years every time someone new moved in and asked about the legendary day Karen drove her car into the lake trying to prove a point. As I packed up my fishing gear and headed toward the house, I glanced back one last time at the moonlit water and smiled, knowing the war was over, the peace was hard won, and no one would ever dare claim my dock as public property again.